Okay, so today we welcome Vlad Tarko on the variety of regulatory regimes. Vlad is associate professor, which is very recent, right? You just got tenure, so congrats on that. And the head of the Department of Political Economy and Moral Science at the University of Arizona. And this paper is co-authored with Ryan Safner, right? Is Ryan on the call? Yeah.
No, he's teaching right now.
Okay, yeah. So he's an assistant professor at Hood College, both George Mason grads. Vlad, I was trying to count. So you have 6 books now, 5 or 6 books written, yes, and 4 of them have been published. Incredibly long CV with wide-ranging interests, so public choice institutions. But if there is like one word that we can associate, I would say polycentricity, right? Is that? Yeah, what that captures the common theme. Okay, and I'm very, very excited for this paper, as I'm sure you all are as well. I think it's very much a paper on entangled political economy, but we can get to that in the question. So, Vlad, it's off to you. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Let me share. Okay, can you see it?
Not, I can't, but I'm really bad at Zoom, so who knows?
Oh, looks great.
Oh,
Like
maybe I need to end. Okay, can you try now? It's so it's black screen. So you started screen sharing, but the screen is black on my end.
Very Zen-like slides, Vlad.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's give you you can take your time figuring it out. Yeah. Yeah, so basically on my end, it's you're viewing Vlad Tarko's screen, and now it's gone, actually.
Yeah, the connection just disconnected. Let me try again.
Sure.
Is this better?
Yep, now we see it. Varieties, yep.
Okay.
You have your slides. Awesome.
Okay, I cannot see the chat. So if you want to interrupt me, I mean, I guess you could just interrupt me or wait afterwards. Either way works for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I want to describe here is the variety of the evolution, institutional evolution of different countries over the past 50 years. So part of the idea here is that there is quite a lot of variety. Therefore, we cannot really have a single model or a single type of explanation for why the observed changes have happened. So we have to have separate different types of explanations for each country. Nonetheless, we may be able to have an overarching framework for how to build this kind of explanations. Okay, so when we're talking about the institutional changes over the past 50 years, a prominent narrative is about neoliberalism. So this word has now increasingly been used in an increasingly vague way, and is more like an insult than an actual descriptive term. But it used to be a more descriptive term, and it used to mean simply a tendency towards both deregulation and the reduction of welfare transfers. So this is how I'm going to use the term. So this was the common use of the term like in the 1990s, but again, the term has kind of deteriorated. So the question is this narrative correct? Does it actually describe what has happened? Can we see this tendency towards deregulation and the reduction in welfare transfers? There is a competing narrative to this, which is regularly called regulatory capitalism. And this competing narrative says that there has been a retreat of the state as an active participant. So there's been privatization, but this retreat of the state has been accompanied by increasing regulation. So rather than having this dual retreat of the state, both in terms of regulation and of welfare transfers, the claim is there's been privatization, and alongside privatization, there's been an increase in the regulatory state. Okay, so what is the actual phenomenon? So with respect to welfare state components, there's pretty good evidence that there has not been a retreat of the state. So the common reasons why people think there's been a retreat of the state is that people are looking at specific items. So it may have happened in various countries that certain welfare services are no longer provided that used to be provided. However, we have to look at the entire aggregate picture. So when you do that, you see that there's been either a constant or an increase in welfare transfers. So that side of the neoliberalism narrative is not correct. A very good book that details this is this book by Brooks and Manza, Why Welfare States Persist. And they make this point that we have to look at the entire set of possible services. Now, what about on the regulatory side of the story? That there, the situation is somewhat more complicated and more interesting. On one hand, in structural terms, we see a massive increase in the regulatory apparatus. So on one hand, we see an increase in the number of regulations, and there's also different methods to look not just the pages in the Federal Register, but also the exact number of restrictions. So both of these have increased a lot. Most of this data is for United States, but it's similar across Europe as well. You can look at other indicators like, say, the number of occupations that require licensing, right? It used to be in the 1950s in United States, only about 5% required licenses. Now it's almost 1 in 3. If you're looking at the independent regulatory agencies, there's been a massive increase in the number of regulatory agencies across the countries, right? So this is not just United States. There's been a massive increase in the budgets. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, my video keeps jerking. So, okay, there's been an increase in the budgets of these regulatory agencies, quite a very large increase. And there's been an increase in the number of people employed in these agencies. So it looks like the regulatory apparatus has increased tremendously, right? So that does not match the narrative that there's been a massive deregulation. However, the picture is more interesting in that if we're looking at various indicators of economic freedom, we actually see deregulation. So this is known as the freer market, more rules puzzle. So it looks like structurally, there's been this increase in the regulatory apparatus, but at the same time, in terms of outcomes, there's been an increase in economic freedom. So what exactly is going on here? Okay, so what are these regulatory agencies doing? If the more there are, the bigger they are, the more people they have, the bigger budgets they have. Nonetheless, the economy seems to be getting more deregulated. The same kind of thing you can find across many different indicators. So this is another example from Europe. You see some of these components of doing business, the cost of starting a business, the time required to start a business has declined tremendously in the European Union. So what exactly can explain this puzzle? And I'm going to show you in a second more data related to this deregulation trend. So there are three big possible explanations here. One is referring to regulatory arbitrage. So this is a very Wagnerian type of explanation. So a common view, which is mistaken, is that there is a monopoly regulator. So there's this picture that you have rent seekers who lobby to this monopolist regulator. But that's not the situation. The situation is of polycentric regulatory system. So what we have is many different regulators acting relatively independent of each other and having overlapping responsibilities. So now these overlapping responsibilities of regulators could lead to two very different outcomes. On one hand, it could lead to a tragedy of the anti-commons if each regulator has a veto power to stop an activity. So then each activity requires permission from many regulators. So that's one possibility, in which case this overlapping regulatory agencies would create more and more, an even greater regulatory burden than a monopolist regulator would. However, there's another possibility, namely of regulatory arbitrage. So that could happen when you could be regulated either by one regulator or by another. So then you can pick and choose your preferred regulator. And once you have a decision from one regulator, you can use that as a kind of legal shield against other regulators. So then you can have this very process in which regulatory agencies expand their activities, right? Like because of mission creep. And because of that, they are starting to overlap. And when that happens, there's an opportunity now for regulatory arbitrage. So that's a possibility that the reason we're seeing this increase in economic freedom could be a consequence of the fact that we have this overlapping regulatory agencies. Now, a very different type of explanation has to do with political entrepreneurship under fiscal constraints. So this is what this paper is mostly concerned with. So the idea here is that you have political actors who respond to voters, but they have to take into account fiscal constraints. So what happens is that voters want these public services, but these public services are expensive. So how are you going to pay for them? So one possibility, so Stephen Vogel actually says that the public choice critique of the regulatory state has actually had an institutional impact in that politicians agreed with that and thought, well, that means regulations are inefficient. So then a way to increase revenues, tax revenues, would be to deregulate. So then the purpose here is to pay for large public services. So how do you pay for them? Well, you may get higher revenues if you deregulate. So that's, say, part of the story that Vogel tells about financial deregulation in France, right? Which is a very strange, apparently strange phenomenon where the French socialist government deregulated finance and did that with the opposition of the banking sector, right? So it kind of doesn't match any of the kind of ideological assumptions, doesn't match the rent-seeking hypothesis either, right? So, but it does match this political entrepreneurship type of narrative, right? So they were under fiscal constraints and they thought if we deregulate finance, we're going to have more financial activity, more economic activity. So the tax revenues will increase. So then we'll have now the fiscal constraints will be actually looser as a consequence of this. And there's a third explanation in terms of ideology. So I think that's that's a neat explanation that doesn't really match the facts. So in the sense that what, say, Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek wanted does not actually fit what we've observed to have happened. So maybe this ideological factor kind of explains the rhetoric that various politicians have taken, but not exactly their behavior. Right? So for example, there's a book by Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman called The Tyranny of the Status Quo. And they're complaining about how, the Reagan Revolution did not actually deliver what the policies that they preferred. Okay, so I think the first two explanations are probably better explanation than the ideological explanation. Okay, so let me have a little bit about methodology. So how do we deal with institutional complexity? So the big challenge with institutional complexity is of nonlinearity. The fact that the effects of one institution are context dependent, and the context is created by other institutions. Right? So the effect of one institution will depend on what other institutions you have. So if you just have like a linear regression, that will not capture those nonlinear effects, right? So that's a huge problem. Now, there are some methods to try to do this. Namely, you could include interaction terms. Now, the problem with that is that how do you decide which interaction terms to include, right? So usually people just use their intuition. However, our intuition is just notoriously unreliable to understand this kind of complex phenomena. So it's not a very reliable method to actually determine which interaction terms to include. And the other problem is that there are many, many possible interaction terms. So you would want ideally a way to kind of map the entire universe of possible interaction terms and know which ones you should pick. There is a method that does this, is known as the qualitative comparative method. It also has like a fuzzy set version, which deals with continuous variables rather than just Boolean variables. And this method basically looks at all the possible interaction terms and chooses the interaction terms that are the most consistent with your data. And it's also very interesting in that instead of just giving you one single way towards a preferred outcome, suppose you're looking at which institutions make countries richer, right? So the preferred outcome is to be as rich as possible. So like a linear regression model will just tell you one single path to that. You will tell you, okay, if you change these institutions, this will be the effect on growth. By contrast, the qualitative comparative method could give you multiple different paths towards the same desired goal, right? So in a sense, it's very interesting. It has a very big downside, unfortunately, namely it's not very robust. So if you have a certain set of variables, you do the method, you get a result, but then you add a few other variables, the results could change dramatically, right? So that's kind of inherent in the fact that this is a nonlinear phenomenon. So these are notoriously, feeble and kind of not robust. So can we have kind of a middle ground between the typical causal inference methods, which do not deal very well with nonlinearity and institutional complexity, and this method, which deals well with institutional complexity, but is very, lacks robustness. So this is what I'm trying to do here. So the proposal I have is to use clustering methods. So the idea with clustering methods is that you're going to create categories based on a set of variables, in my case, institutions, and then you're going to compare the outcomes between those categories. Now, these outcomes are not part of the variables that you use to create the categories, right? So you have these two completely independent analyses. One, you create the categories, and 2, you just look at the outcomes between categories. So now the advantage of this, right? So for example, I'm going to use economic policies as the variables. So you can have here many, many variables, and you can create categories based on the set of all those variables. And then I'm going to look at various outcomes like growth, like equality, democracy, and so on. Right? So these outcomes are not included in the first set of institutions. Right? So because of this, we don't have the kind of overfitting problem, right? Because we're creating the categories based on a completely different set of institutions. In principle, there's no reason why there should be any differences between the categories. Right? So if you find a difference, that's that's something that's relevant because it wasn't baked. The difference wasn't baked in the categories. Now, it also turns out that it's far more robust than QCA. And it can take institutional complexity into account because you can build these categories based on many institutions, and you are not looking at the effects of a single institution. You're just looking at the effects of a set of institutions. Now, the main disadvantage is that this is not a causal method. Right, so if you want to use this for policy analysis, the best you can do is to say, well, developing countries to become richer, they should adopt institutions that are more similar to richer countries. So you can look at where exactly those institutions differ, but it's still not a causal model in the same sense in which the standard econometric methods are trying to get at causality. Okay, so the data I'm using are the subcomponents from Frazier's economic freedom of the world. So they are usually aggregating all of these. So I'm just using the raw subcomponents. So those are my institutional variables. So then I want to look not just at how similar countries are at a given moment in time, but I want to look at the similarity between trajectories between time, right? Because I'm interested in why the changes have occurred. So I want to see which countries have had a similar type of trajectory. So then what I'm doing is I'm looking at similarities between these trajectories over time. So each country is described by a vector of all these components from 1970 to 2015, and there is a 5-year gap between these. So the reason for the 5-year gap is that the data starts off with this 5-year gap. More recently, it's yearly, but I didn't want to include the yearly data because it would have biased the analysis towards the present. So now with this, it's not biased towards the present. So now there are 50 subcomponents, but many of these subcomponents have a lot of missing data. So I'm only using the countries. I chose 42 countries that have quite a lot of data. Okay, so the clustering method, the way it works is it looks at similarities between these vectors that in my case describe trajectories of countries. So what do we mean by a similarity between vectors? It's simply the Euclidean distance between those two vectors. So what the method does, it calculated all the pairs of these distances, and then it puts together those countries that have a small distance together, those that have a big distance further apart. Right? So it builds this tree, of similarities. So here, say United Kingdom and Ireland, they have the most similar economic policies compared to other countries, right? So you can cut this tree wherever you want. So I cut it here. Sorry, I cut it here. So we have 3 categories. So we have all these countries in this category have similar economic policies to each other. Their economic policies are more similar to each other than there are to the countries from the other categories. and the same, the countries in this category and the countries in this category. So one thing that I have here is that we recover this classic varieties of capitalism distinction between liberal and coordinated economies. So in one of the books that Marta showed at the beginning, the Capitalist Alternatives book, we did there a different type of analysis using very different variables, the variables that the varieties of capitalism literature proposes, and you get a very similar type of result. Right, so this is what I meant by saying that this is a very robust method. Even if you choose very different variables, you are going to get a fairly similar set of categories. Right, so that's obviously important. Now, another kind of interesting thing that you can use this method for is to look at weird cases, right? So for example, here you have Malaysia that it turns out it has very similar economic policies to these liberal rich countries. So that raises a question, why isn't Malaysia a rich country like these others? I have no idea why, but this method kind of will highlight to you cases of interest where something very interesting may be going on. Right, so in a sense, the fact that Malaysia is here, it shows that these factors that I've used, these economic policies, are not a complete explanation for what's going on in a country in terms of economics. Okay, so now if we're looking at the trajectory over time of these different categories, we see quite a bit of a difference. So each thin line here is a different country, and the thick lines are the categories. This is just the average of all the countries in that category. So one thing that you will notice is that there is a similar kind of trajectory across categories, but the starting points are very different. Right, so we see everywhere that from 1970 to 1980, there's been this increase in the size of government and without much of a change in the regulation. And then from the 1980s to the present, we have this neoliberal era where we see both a decrease in the size of government and deregulation. And it's the same for all the categories, okay? But the liberal countries have much smaller government than the coordinated ones, and at each moment in time, they are more deregulated, right? But say the coordinated countries now on average are more deregulated than the liberal countries used to be in the 1970s. With developing countries, they also have this kind of trajectory of smaller government and deregulation, but still they remain far more regulated than both the coordinated and the liberal economies. Now, if you're looking at individual countries, and this is one of the main results I want you to take from this, is the fact that there is a huge diversity of these trajectories across countries, right? So for example, Japan, right, it always has been a fairly deregulated economy, and it has had this massive increase in the size of government. By contrast, say Switzerland has always had the small government, and they have had this massive deregulation, right? Very different trajectory. Or if you look at France, right, Germany, right, you see all these different types of trajectories happening. So that now if we're asking the political question as to why we see these trajectories, you cannot have the same single explanation because the trajectories have been so different. However, maybe we can have a general framework for how to try to come up with an explanation. So this is what political entrepreneurship under fiscal constraints is trying to do, right? The idea is, well, there's been these different trajectories in different countries, but because the conditions have been different. Okay, so political entrepreneurship has acted differently their constraints may have been different. Okay, let me show you in more detail this regulation and size of government, right? So these are very aggregated. So with respect to regulations, they are pretty much the same story across different types of regulation, but you do see quite a bit of differences. So the liberal economies have much more deregulated labor markets than both developing countries and coordinated economies, right? So this is a well-known fact that, you know, like in France, the labor market is much more regulated than in United States or Japan. By contrast, notice that the financial regulations are relatively similar in both the liberal and the coordinated countries. I think this may be very relevant. Okay, by contrast, the developing countries have more regulated credit markets. Okay, now a more interesting picture appears when we are disaggregating the government size variable. So we see that that declining government size is actually due 100% due to privatizations. Right? So on the other hand, if you're looking at government consumption, spending, and transfers and subsidies, these have increased in all the different categories. You still see that the liberal economies have much smaller transfers than coordinated economies, but there's been this trend, upwards trend in both countries, right? But in here, you saw this decline in the size of government. That was due to privatizations. Right, so that is the regulatory capitalism narrative going on, right? So that narrative says, well, these privatizations have been accompanied by this increase in the regulatory state, right? So that increase in the regulatory state, right, is real in the structural sense. However, the effects of that increase in the regulatory state is not necessarily more regulation, right? So that's kind of part of what's interesting here. Now, if we're looking at the institutional differences across these categories, you will see that coordinated and liberal economies are very similar to each other in terms of the freedom to trade, in terms of protections of property rights, and in terms of sound money. So that is one of the biggest differences between developing countries and rich countries, right? So no matter which rich country you're looking at, you know, they're going to have strong protections of property. They're going to have a lot of freedom to trade. They're going to have sound money. Now, with respect to regulations, you still have what I said earlier, what I showed you earlier, that developing countries are more regulated than even the coordinated economies, right? And these are statistically significant differences. By contrast, if you're looking at the size of government, the coordinated economy has the much bigger size of government. So now, if you're familiar with the developing economics literature, a lot of the policies proposed there have to do with the size of government, with how those developing countries should spend more on various public services, right? So that's very different than what you see from this picture. That is not the institutional dissimilarity, right? So if you're looking at what kind of institutions the developing countries don't have that the rich countries have, right? Those institutions have to do with property rights, freedom to trade, sound money. That's the main thing, okay? And regulation, over-regulation. It does not have to do with the size of government, because liberal economies have about the same size of government and they are very rich. So that's not the difference. Okay, so let me show you now, what about outcomes? So these are variables that have not been included in the analysis when I did the clusters. So one of the classic varieties of capitalism results is that liberal and coordinated economies are have about the same incomes. You see that here as well. However, the liberal economies tend to grow faster, right? Now, obviously, if that happens over a long period of time, the incomes will also differ. But the idea here is that innovation tends to happen in the liberal economies, and then the coordinated economies have very good institutions of adopting whatever innovations have been created. So now this may have like an interesting historical reason for it. So if you're looking at income in 1800s, right, at the beginning of the 19th century, the liberal economies tended to be richer than coordinated economies. So you can think of the institutions of the coordinated economies as being designed to catch up with the liberal economies. And to some extent, they still have those institutions that are better suited for catching up rather than advancing the frontier. Right? So to give you just one example, in Germany, there is a state-sponsored training program, right? So that works if you know what you need to train the people for, right? So that's a typical catch-up policy. If you're on the frontier, you don't know what the new skills are going to be needed, right? So then, say, United States doesn't have that kind of program. Now, some people argue United States should have that kind of program, maybe. But the point I'm making here is just that this is a type of institution that you can make sense of if you're thinking, well, they're trying to catch up, right? So they already know what kind of skills the workers need. So then they have this program to catch up. Okay, so now in terms of the other types of outcomes, right? So it's not just income that the liberal and coordinated economies are very similar. The life expectancy is the same. The amount of liberal democracy is the same, right? There are some outliers here like Singapore in the liberal side, but overall they're about the same level of liberal democracy, the same level of corruption. Okay, there is a big difference in terms of unemployment, right? So this has to do with the fact that the labor market in liberal economies is much more deregulated. So you have far less unemployment. So the other big difference and kind of classic difference in the varieties of capitalism literature is the fact that liberal economies are more unequal than coordinated economy. So this is how the situation is usually described, right? So there are different kind of performance criteria that people may care about, and growth may be one, but equality may be another. So there's a trade-off here between growth and equality. So you may prefer growth, then you would prefer the liberal economies, or you may prefer more equal societies, then you would prefer the coordinated economies. So the whole varieties of capitalism literature started, in the late 90s as a way to say, no, there are more than one model of capitalism that may be justifiable.
Vlad, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. You probably didn't see my chat messages, but we are over time. So if you just could close it, and I'm sure we can get to the rest of the story for the questions.
Let me do one more slide.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so how would you explain this kind of diversity of policies? So the way in which political entrepreneurship is usually described is like the focus is on the entrepreneur. And what me and Ryan Safner are proposing is that maybe we should focus more on the constraints that the entrepreneurs are facing, right? So in a typical supply and demand analysis, the entrepreneur is not there. The entrepreneur is what's doing the motions. So usually in regular economics, we don't have enough of a place for the entrepreneur. We put too much emphasis on just the supply and demand analysis. So, but in the analysis of political change, it seems that we're putting too much emphasis on the agency of political agents. So the constraints they're facing may actually be more important. So we want to switch to kind of a more supply and demand analysis of policy. So there you can think of rent seekers as demanding certain policies, but if a politician goes along with that, it's going to create some political cost because they want to get reelected. And then public opinion is in a sense the supply for that type of policy, right? So if the public opinion agrees with the kind of policy that, say, the rent seekers want, then you can get it with low political cost. Right, so if you think in terms of the Taluk paradox, that, well, the rent seekers seem to have a lot to gain from rent seeking. So why aren't they paying more for rent seeking, right? Well, that's a mistake in analysis, because it's thinking that the price of something is determined purely by the willingness to pay of the consumer, right? So the rent seeker may be willing to pay a lot, but it matters what the public opinion is. So the price is determined both by public opinion and by rent seeking, rather than purely by the gains and the willingness to pay of rent seekers. So that's just one example of where you can go with this analysis. So, okay, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation, great paper. So as participants form the queue, again, use that raise hand and we'll use that for questions. But I want to start you off sort of with my interpretation of the paper, and I wonder if you agree. And I actually have a bunch of questions, but I will save those for later. But the way I understand the paper, it's all economies, all industries are entangled. So there's no such thing as a free market, but the forms of entangled differ. So what you're trying to do here is basically explain this omnipresence of entanglement and the evolving patterns. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I guess that, yeah, I think that's a fair description, yeah.
Okay, okay. All right, and I feel like we have sound. Is it just on my end, the sound sort of like, no? How do I fix that?
Yeah, we're getting some weird feedback from Vlad, or at least I think, at least Marta and I have some weird feedback from Vlad right now. So I don't know, maybe mute and unmute.
All right. Okay. Oh, I know, Vlad, can we test it out? Let's see. All right. Anyway, so let's see. Okay, do we have any questions? Anyone wants to start with the questions, or yeah? Okay, let's go.
Cameron has his hands up.
Okay, okay. Right. Okay, so Cameron, go ahead, or yeah.
Hey, so I really liked the that very last thing you talked about with the supply and demand framework. And I was initially skeptical when I was reading the paper, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. But I have a few questions about it. First of all, there's a question of elasticities. Because I can think of reasons why I would expect both curves to be fairly flat. For example, rent seeking is determined itself by public opinion. For example, you see this in a lot of the woke capitalism, right? They're bending essentially to public opinion. And you might expect the supply curve to be flat because public opinion is generally kind of incoherent. So what that would lead me to expect is that you get a lot of variation in the outcomes when the curve shifts and not a lot of variation in the political cost. And so my next question would be, if you were to do a case study in one of these countries from figure 3 with the squiggle diagrams and explain the motion of those squiggles through these supply and demand diagrams and which curve is shifting, how do you operationalize political costs? Like, what is, like, I have an intuitive sense of, of what political capital or political cost is, but how would you operationalize that?
Yeah, the short story, the short answer is I don't know. But the longer answer is that I think the key is to disentangle the markets for different policies. So I think part of the reason you think they're flat is because you're putting everything together. So kind of we're in the paper, we're disaggregating a little bit by saying, look at regulations and look at public services. So the regulations are not very salient to the voters. Therefore, what you said is actually the case. But the public services are very salient. So then the public opinion will matter more on that side of the story than on the regulation side of the story, which explains why say the politicians have more leeway to do changes in the regulatory realm than in the public services realm. So I'm not fully answering your question, but that's kind of how I would go about. Yeah, so, okay, let me give you like a rough idea about the political cost. You could look at how the polarization in Congress, like when they're voting for something, this is recorded, like how many of each party have voted for that particular policy. And the vast majority of policies are, they pass with like 90%, like they're not, there's like cross-partisan, most of them, but some of them are not. So now if there's a big polarization there, you would presumably expect that the political cost may be higher. So I don't know, you will have to find like various ingenious ways to assess the cost.
So maybe Joe Manchin is bearing lots of political costs then.
Okay, sorry, I need to jump in again, Vlad. I'm very sorry, but I'm getting chat messages and so on. We all are having trouble with your sound. It's like Darth Vader a little bit, like your voice, but in a Darth Vader mode with like buzzing. It's bad, right? It's, I don't know. I have a hard time focusing. So I texted you through the chat, like a support from Zoom. Can you just like look at it and see if any of the issues apply? Sorry, we'll take 2 minutes and see if we can fix it. And if not, we'll go back to the Darth Vader mode and we'll power through. But see if any of that stuff.
Is it better now?
No. Yeah,
something might have happened because at the beginning it was great, and then
What about now?
A little, maybe better. It's interesting that you don't hear it. That's yeah. It started towards like second to last, when you were on your last slide. I think that's when it started.
Oh no. What about now?
It's fixed. Okay, awesome. Okay, we've resolved it. So were you done responding to Cameron, or is there? Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Pedro. So Pedro, do you want to? Are you ready to ask your question now? Yeah.
I have a few, but I also want to see how the debate goes. My first one, and then I will stop there, is the different experience that I had reading your paper and watching your presentation. So it's like I got from your presentation where you want to get, but on the paper there is another debate where you didn't mention much during the presentation, which is your attempt to criticize and like identify which are the best narratives for what we have today. So you have all this intellectual debate going on the paper, where and then on the presentation we're mostly talking about, which is quite interesting, which is a great part of the paper, which is the clustering and how you did all the aggregations. which are nice. But then I was curious about that take. What is the entail that you're also having from the paper? Because it surprised me a lot with the grouping of the nations, like some South Korea being like, as you mentioned on the talk, they're like, look, those policies are a lot closer among the groups than between one country with another country from another group. And then I thought, okay, but then we have South Korea and Israel in a group with Peru and Brazil and things like that. So that puzzled me a little bit, but I think it's part of the project that just discredit most of the narratives of what we have today and say like, oh, look, reality is a lot more complex than ideology. So I was just curious about what for you is the most robust tale of this all is on that part. But I have a few other comments, but I'll bring later.
Yeah, so frankly, I don't know that much about South Korea. So I know that a lot of people want to claim South Korea for either like the liberal or like the industrial policy stuff. So maybe it doesn't actually fit either. And this is part of the reason why it can be claimed by different people with different ideological intentions. Right, it's actually like a more complicated story. Their institutions don't actually match any of the existing models, but then people just pick and choose parts of it. That would be my guess. But again, I don't know that much about South Korea.
You had this last phrase that you say that ideology is more of a distraction, which I found was quite interesting. So for you, there is no ideological theory that kind of holds up. It's like
yeah, so I don't want to dismiss the importance of ideology altogether, but it just seems to me that if you're looking, people say, well, Hayek has had a huge impact on policy. Well, if you're looking at what policies Hayek was supporting and what policies supposedly he influenced, they're not that similar, right? The same with Milton Friedman and so on. So, right, it's not like the influence is not at the level of the policy. It's more like at the level of, I don't know, some sort of feeling or rhetoric that people use.
Okay. All right. I don't see any hands, so I'm going to jump in with my question, really on the political entrepreneurship here, and it ties to the public opinion, right? But instead, I would probably talk about sentiments. So oftentimes in Wagner's writing, you will find that like democracies are always in a mode of reforms, right? Like there's always reforms. So the way I would think about it with your paper is every regulatory regime is subject to criticism, and there are always negative sentiments around any regulatory regime. So, and entrepreneurs differ in like there's heterogeneity among political entrepreneurs in the relationship, right? Some are in this gains trap, right? Like some are benefiting and some are aspiring to benefit from the regime. So to me, it's like this trying to build on the sentiments, on the weaknesses of any regime to bring about change. And I guess I think your paper captures like the state of different regulatory regimes, but I guess the next step would be to explain, right? Like how this, under what conditions political entrepreneurs are successful to change the regulatory regimes and for different set of entrepreneurs to benefit and when they fail. And I think Pete Betke's story of perestroika and the transition, right? Like that's the story of this shift in political entrepreneurs where the old regime benefited like the old generation, and as they started dying out, that created an opportunity for new political entrepreneurs and new set of regulations. Anyway, I just throwing it out there with the sentiments and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I don't disagree that, yeah, ultimately it's important to look at this diversity of entrepreneurs, and they're picking up some opportunities others didn't. But it seems to me that that is the thing that everybody is focusing on, and what is downplayed or not, people don't pay attention to, is the constraints within which this entrepreneurial fight is happening. And I think that that's kind of what we're trying to capture with the supply and demand, right? Because the entrepreneurs are the ones moving around the curves, but like, okay, what exactly are the constraints within which they're operating, right? So I don't disagree with what you said, but I think there's like this other important part that is actually people don't pay enough attention to. Right? So people just ascribe too much importance to what the politicians want, right? It's like the French socialist government. Okay, I'm not calling them socialists. They call themselves socialists. They did not want to deregulate finance, okay? And yet they did that. And the banking sector told them, don't do this. This is a terrible idea. And they did it, right? It's not an explanation that they're not driven there by ideology to do that.
Oh, okay, so that's actually something I didn't understand in the paper, because down, like later on, I won't be able to find it now, but you actually say that in the end, they ended up regulating the banking industry, right? Like they centralized and moved.
Not as much as it was before.
Right, okay.
Yeah, let me say something about that. So you can make this observation that if you just take the regulatory capitalism narrative, that is like they privatized and then regulated. Well, you can get the exact same outcome with regulating as you had with the state-owned industries, right? So it's a bit of a puzzle. Then why would you do it if you would then try to arrive at the same outcome, but with a different method, right? So this is kind of what we need to explain when we're looking at the political entrepreneurship.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, right? Like that's definitely the puzzle. Okay, Pedro, do you wanna?
I mark that part of the financial regulation because it's kind of my field, and then you have this dual politics going on, and because a lot of it is, of course, national politics, but international financial regulation, sorry, is more and more an international game as well. And also you have another players in the entrepreneurial game doing that, and then like maybe the policy preference is different. But my comment was a bit different. Like so I'm reading the paper and I'm wearing my neoliberal hat, and then it's hard to win. Like if it's more regulation, then it's neoliberal fault. It's less regulation, it's neoliberal fault. So it's like you always have these guys to blame, and then like every outcome is our fault. And then I was curious, like if that was the right way to frame it when you separate the groups, because then what I was thinking is that like you could have a neoliberal tale saying that the objective is to bring market-based solutions everywhere. So if we find that maybe there are some regulations getting in the way of having a market system, letting prices emerge and transactions take place, so you have regulations in the way, so we should deregulate here, so we let market imperialism come and so on. And sometimes like, oh, the market is missing there. So we have maybe too much communitarian norms or too much like state ownership, and then prices and trade are not taking place. So I will go there and then create certain norms and impose a certain type of regulation to let the market base, like imposed, but a market kind of proxy to take place. So you could have both outcomes, like maybe you bring more norms or you take some norms out and then you bring that. And then I started looking how your data would show that. But as I see, you also use the Fraser Institute dataset, which from my understanding, sometimes they put both of them, so they have an outcome. They have like the set of regulations where they value this is more friendly toward economic freedom, and those are not that much in economic freedom when they are ranking and giving their points. So, and that's not necessarily more or less regulation. They are also aiming at a specific set of institutions and norms to get that ranking there. And then I was curious about that. If the phrase institute is also,
but I didn't use the ranking at all.
Okay.
I
just
use the underlining data that they're using to create the rankings, but you can just use the data without believing that what the rankings are, you could have any opinion on the rankings.
Okay, and then there wouldn't be this problematic of more and less norms. You can also observe, because then I'm thinking about a qualitative assessment on, are these norms the one that leads to more market solutions, or these norms are not? Maybe it's more or less, or it doesn't, like, it's on the content of the norm itself, instead of just more duties and less duties, things like that. I don't know if this comment makes sense.
Yeah, so countries could change these policies, right, from that data on like 50 different margins. And they did on those 50 margins across time. So I'm just trying to see which ones were more similar to each other, which were less similar to each other, and then see, okay, what's the outcome in terms of growth, equality, life expectancy, and so on. Right, so this is kind of the big disadvantage of this method, that it doesn't connect this particular policy to this particular outcome. Right? I cannot tell you here, okay, if you change this policy 2 points, how will life expectancy change? I have no idea. Right? That's just not part of this method.
Okay, Roger.
Thanks. Yeah, Vlad, I don't know how to frame my question, because I have to confess, I don't feel like I understand where you're going, what your point is. You forgive me if that's just that I'm being a dull boy today. You gave the example of socialists doing something along the lines of bank deregulation. I also think of the trucking and airlines deregulation we got under the Carter administration. And then the big guy in Congress who's most important in seeing that through, shepherding that through, was a fellow named Ted Kennedy. So, and then you said, well, so it's not ideology. But I thought we sort of knew that. I didn't think that people on this, in this group would be like, yeah, the Republicans are all for free markets and we need more of that, right? And then, we don't know what free markets are, but whatever they are, that's what the Republicans do, So I'm not seeing where the contribution is. Again, sincere apologies if I'm just being like dull or something. I'm not getting the message.
Yeah, that is just a throwaway line there. It's just there is a big literature that claims that, right? Both like pro-neoliberal and anti-neoliberal. Like the whole reason why neoliberalism is such a scare story is because people think, well, this ideology has had tremendous policy impact. And yeah, this is not what the paper is about, but it's just, if we're going to list the possible reasons for change, that is a prominent reason that people give. I agree with you, that's not a very good reason. Like just descriptively, it's not a good explanation.
Well, okay, thank you for that. I just have to confess that I don't feel like I know what the paper is about, but I think I may be the only one on the call who feels that way, so I'll blame myself.
I'm gonna jump in on that because to some extent, okay, I think I agree with Vlad that that's not what the paper is about, and he does a good job in the end of creating something quite novel with this heterogeneity, like the diversity of policies. And anyway, but at the same time, and maybe it's just the nature of our crowd. We are not the most politically diverse group, right? So, but I also was kind of over the whole neoliberalism discussion, and it was a little distracting. It was like, well, we already know that, right? And to me, the value was this rowing steering distinction, right? Like basically you have these guys there that you cite that made that distinction between rowing and steering. And now you're actually showing that, well, it's not, it's a difference in methods, right? But not in the extent of regulation. Anyway, but with that, I actually have a question. Where would a country that uses, like a theoretical country that only uses vouchers, right? So they are a provider state because they provide, but they use vouchers. Where would they be, right? Like, because it seems like in the paper you assume that the provider state would also have a control over the means of production, but if it's public finance and private provision, where would they belong in the category? Like you have that really neat table, which was a great way to sort of organize the thinking, but I guess the vouchers case, I couldn't place that if I, yeah.
Yeah, so, well, so I think the problem here is that that government size variable is kind of too aggregated.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that when you're looking at what exactly changed, right? So it includes both like the transfers that you're talking about and the ownership, right? So if you no longer have a lot of ownership, but you just have this voucher system, depending on the value of the voucher, you probably would have a lower size of government. Right. But yeah, the main point there with the distinction between provider and welfare state is that the provider state is a deregulated economy with a big role for social services, government provided social services. So that's a rather different model than what people normally think of the welfare state, where they put together, if you support large interventions, social interventions, then you also have to support the big regulations. That's not necessarily the case. So that's what the provider state is trying to get at. It's not really describing how exactly you're going to provide those public services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right, and Pedro, right?
Yeah, sorry for being so annoying. No, I was also thinking about Roger's point, because that was also puzzle, like, okay, so many things going on in this paper. We have an intellectual debate, we have the data set debate, we have all these theories of entrepreneurship, political entrepreneurship going on. But maybe what I get, and I thought was the most fascinating, is exactly that, on the rowing and steering, and in the table of the nations, no, the part that you have the little boats going, sometimes just rowing in circles and then staying in the same boat, like moving a little bit, and how they row and steer so differently. And then that I also thought was quite fascinating on we think about the magnitude of ideology, because ideology is not circumscribed in one nation or one set of like the policy of a nation state specific, but is usually broader. And we have all this comparative analysis. And you're telling me here that everybody was reacting kind of differently. They were like all navigating around. We can cluster them in certain groups, but they all have their own directions. And in this part, I thought like this tale on everything diverse was what I was thinking would be your end set. You would kind of end here, but then you keep on going. And then I was missing a little bit of more attention to that tale of each nation, and then what's the outcome of that? Yeah, sorry, it was more like a comment than a question.
Yeah, I missed the last thing you said. The last two sentences.
Yeah, no, that was missing a little bit more of elaboration on these individual tales, but I think you might not also wanna enter on that, no, because then it also open a big door for your paper, and then it's even more stuff on it.
Yeah, we debated whether to make it two papers or one paper, and I'm not sure we made the right decision to make it one paper. So yeah, it's kind of a strange way in which we put the empirical analysis before the theory. But the reason for that is that the empirical analysis is justifying why we do the theory that way. Why do you actually need that theory? Right? But otherwise, if that's kind of what our problem was, that framework seems just too simple. And if you just presented it, it sounds a bit arbitrary, right? We could start with rowing and steering, and people may say, well, why rowing and steering? Why not just do one of those markets for each different policies? Right, so kind of part of the explanation for that is in the data analysis. Yeah, so but we did have this problem, like, should we make it 2 papers or 1?
No, yeah, that's interesting. You probably have more than 1 paper in there, right? But I mean, this to some extent this is a matter of organization, which you can figure out without our input, I'm sure. But yeah, okay. So the rowing and steering thing, right? Like which seems to be the key to this paper. There is a little bit of like the fiscal illusion connection there too, right? So you could think of this like every time we get excited about like a shift towards free market, really it's just a shift in the method of the capture, right? In the forms of attachment. And yeah, so I think that the fiscal illusion thing might be there. And I think another question, so vouchers was one question, another question, and I get it that the data isn't going to answer this question, but you have this table 1, taxonomy of economic systems. So like in that, right, like where would you place the distinction between like the socialist, like Soviet Union socialism versus the fascism, like fascism of the Third Reich, right? Like where you have nominal private property, but really the state is in charge. Like, is there place in the table for that? Yeah.
They're in the same place.
Okay.
It's socialist there.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So with respect to what you said a bit earlier, so it's like getting excited about market policies and then finding out, well, there's this other thing going on. It's also the other way around, where people are looking at this data about the increase of the regulatory state, and they're saying, oh my God, this is nothing is free anymore. But then when you're looking at the actual data of economic freedom, it looks like it's increasing. So what's going on? And so I think that's a very interesting puzzle. Yeah. That the fact that economic freedom is not achieved in the most straightforward way in which you would expect. It's sometimes achieved in this weird, kind of complicated ways, right? As a result of this entangled polycentric system, right? The way we usually think is like, well, it's the government, and we have to get the government to do the policies we want. But in fact, there is no the government. It's like this network of institutions, and they interact in all sorts of weird ways, and you have this outcome that's like an emergent outcome. So sometimes that emergent outcome is more economic freedom, despite the fact that there are all these new regulatory agencies in place. So now to actually understand how that outcome comes to be, that it's tricky. It's not obvious at all why having all these regulatory agencies would lead to more economic freedom. You can make sense why it would lead to a disaster with that anti-commons idea.
Yeah. James, yeah.
Thank you for the paper, Vlad. As you're talking about this, it struck me that there might be a parallel with early economic development, say in England, where you see in the early development of capitalism, a lot of times it's the monopolies that lead to, I don't know what you want to call them, but you could say being tied to the aggregation of capital. Right? And a lot of the literature on early economic activity, like you look at pre-capitalist societies, or what we would think of as pre-modern societies, probably be a better word. Like in Babylon, capital was aggregated at the temples a lot of times. So maybe there's a story here similar to that. I don't know what that would be, but you know, those sorts of stories tend to contravene our traditional understanding in economics of monopoly being bad, of a lack of freedom in markets being bad. There's some sort of institutional interaction in those stories that I think may form a nice parallel just to think about.
Right. And I think this will have to be, oh, sorry, Vlad, go ahead. I'm sorry. We still have
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah, I think it's very interesting.
Okay, and actually that was our last question. We are out of time. I like to finish 10 before, it's 3 minutes, so 10 to 3 minutes, or our 10 to 2, no, 10 to 4 on the East Coast, just so you can get to your next thing if you have one. Next, we will be meeting on November 16th, so right before the Southerns. And that's going to be Michaela Novak on dramaturgical Wagner. So basically, so those Shakespearean analogies and sociology within the entangled political economy framework. And Dick Wagner is most likely going to join us again for that presentation. So it should be another interesting exchange. Thank you all for coming on the call. Vlad, thank you for excellent presentation. You gave us clearly all a lot to think about. It really does seem like a very, very interesting and productive project. So thank you very much, everyone.